This is the Make Planning Make Sense podcast. I'm Aaron Zimmerman. I'm a director at Centro, and I'm your host. We take a tailored planning approach on complex applications, appeals, and strategy to turn potential into results for developers, landowners, and architects nationwide. Our guests for this episode are Charlotte Morphet, program leader for urban planning at the University of the Built Environment, and Marina Milosev, co-founder of Beyond the Red Line, and recently urban planning expert at the United Nations. If you're listening to this podcast, you're probably the sort who has been following the public discussion about mainstreaming sex and gender into the NPPF and planning more broadly. We dive into this topic with our sights set on the practical questions of implementation for applicants and decision takers. If you like today's episode, share it with your fellow Planimals, and please do follow the show. And remember, we're ultimately here for you. Whenever you have a complex project that needs excellent planners on the team, please get in touch. Find us on LinkedIn, and stay in touch on Instagram, X, and Blue Sky at MPMS Podcast. Here's our conversation with Charlotte Morphet and Marina Milosev. Charlotte Morphet and Marina Milosev, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
We're also pleased to welcome Centro's own Andrew Lightstone to the podcast for the first time. He's an associate director here. Welcome.
You. Happy to be here.
We always like to start off with who you are and your roles.
I'm Marina by background. I'm an urban planner and landscape architect. Pretty much most of my career spent in London working in strategic urban planning. And actually for the past 1 year, I was working for UN Habitat as urban planning expert in Ukraine. Also, I am a co-founder of Beyond the Red Line, a consultancy that is providing urban planning services, but also with a particular focus on social equality and specifically gender equality, which is something that I kind of spent the past 5 years really looking into.
Terrific. Welcome.
Always hard to follow you, Marina. And I'm Charlotte. I'm a planner by background. I've been a chartered planner for the last 15 years, and in the last 4 moved into academia and recently joined the University of the Built Environment as the program leader for urban planning. Lots of my research focuses on gender, so I've worked with Marina before, in the last year actually. Although we do have a past history of being duty to cooperate neighbours back when I worked at Wolf and Forest and she was at LLDC. A lot of my research focuses on gender. I'm doing a PhD on women working in planning, but do a lot of work on gender-informed planning. And I'm also the co-founder and national co-chair of Women in Planning, which focuses on women's experiences in the profession, but also how we make gender-inclusive planning environments.
Terrific. So the theme of the episode is the intersection between gender and sex identity with the planning world. And I've said it to Councillor Okereke before, you're talking to just absolute nerds who are trying to ferry planning proposals across the River Styx. So the idea of how these interact in practice is a really fascinating question to my mind. There's been a little bit of NPPF drama, is it fair to say?
I definitely would say it was drama, yeah.
Why don't we set the scene in a larger picture? Can you give us a sense of how the built environment influences women and other identity roles?
It's a hard one to be. Gender diverse, I would just say. Women and gender diverse or gender fluid people, maybe.
Yeah, I just want to say sex as many times as possible. But then also
oh my God, you two working together is going to be very dangerous. Don't sit next to him. He's a bad influence.
We sit behind each other, it's fine.
Yeah.
Because I'm thinking about gender in terms of queerness as well. I want to, I know that that's an inclusive part of the considerations.
Yeah, it is.
To you guys as well.
If you were to understand women's experiences, just understand their experiences more broadly in society. So if you just think about how the system is set up, it is set up for male cis men. We need to take into consideration that women do have the higher care responsibility, whether we like it or not, and whether that's looking after children or looking after other family members or just other people in society. They're more likely to earn less. They're more likely to have less pension. They're more likely to be a single parent. And then if you layer how that might impact how they use the city or a place, so things like they might more likely to need affordable housing, more likely to work locally, more likely to take different journeys around a place, like with trip changing to get shopping, pick kids up from school, drop things off to a neighbour or somebody. They're more likely to work part-time, all of those different considerations, and then how that interacts with how they use a place. I don't know if I've missed anything that you think is obvious, Marina.
No, you listed quite a variety of different things, because I feel this discussion often gets narrowly focused on safety, which obviously is a very important aspect. And the data shows that women way more fear using public spaces than men. So that is the factual thing, but it's not the only thing. And I think focusing the topic on safety, to me, kind of like a little bit projects onto the woman and embrace gender inequality, seeing women as a victim rather than having the right to the city. And I think the housing is crucially important, because gender inequality effectively is driven by differences in access to assets, so wealth and housing. This is where gender equality, in essence, is shaped and defined. When we're talking about this, we are thinking of all aspects, so climate, housing, everything that as a planner we are shaping, not just safety.
Yeah, I agree. With housing as well, I think we forget women live longer. So when we're pushing for like ageing populations, it is going to be gendered, and it's going to probably be more focused on women. Some of the stats around it, though, that women are more likely to die in climate disasters. But I do think the safety is very important. It is obviously something that lands with people. One of the statistics is over 70% of women in the UK have been sexually harassed in a public space. The other side of that is that you're more likely to be attacked or murdered by somebody you know in your home. But I think the thing about the safety debate is safety is a very low bar. And if that is the only way we think women interact with the planning system or with the way that we do placemaking, then I think we all need to look at ourselves.
Yeah.
You know, they're 50% of the population. But I understand if you're at the hard-nosed end of like being a planning consultant, submitting a planning application and thinking about actually, what is it that we can do in this?
Yes.
It doesn't all lie at that end. It probably is a lot further upstream.
Yeah.
And sometimes I would argue, and this is where me and Marina may differ slightly, that sometimes planning is probably like, it should be in there, absolutely. But if we've not considered it before then, it's probably quite late in a process. So it should be considered much earlier and upstream.
And I think that's the question of, if I was an architect or a client and I had a big space, I wanted to design it as a white cisgendered male, I wouldn't have the first clue of what women need. So what would I, as the designer, have to do to make sure that the voices of women are heard enough to then shape this design?
Well, I think this is taking us to the core of this discussion, which is like, okay, we all recognize that the cities have been traditionally designed by cisgender, in the UK, white men. But what does it mean to design for women or for, right, the wider diversity of our population? So when it comes to gender, obviously it is designing for their needs. And as a planners, let's start there. Where do we start learning about those? It's through engagement. It is through data collection. It is through evidence base. So the point here is not about doing anything that we don't do, but it is about doing it with intention to understand the lived experiences of the more diverse audience. So a very simple example would be starting with the planning policy, not because I'm a policy planner, but to me, planning starts with planning policy. This is a practice, right? Any decision that we write into the local plans needs to be evidence-led. So the work starts here. Gender disaggregating data is the first thing to do. So when we are saying the local economy, who is in that local economy? Or let's say we're mapping, need for public spaces, etc. Who is actually using it? Who are we designing for? Who is the current user? And for those who are absent, why are they absent? And what can we do about that? So in planning policy, obviously you would expect that this data is reflected in your policies. So let's say the fact that play spaces are predominantly used by boys, particularly the data shows that after age of 8, girls disappear from public spaces. They feel less confident using public play spaces. So then the question is like how through the policies we can encourage that the design reflects the needs of everyone. And then when we come to design, obviously you're hoping that's reflected as a policy requirement to, let's say, design for teenage girls or young women. And then is the question of what are their needs? Then is a consultation and consulting specifically with those groups, and also thinking about the intersectionality is very important. We won't be today here talking about women and girls as a homogeneous entity, we need to be thinking about the intersectionality. So age, socioeconomic background, so all that goes into being a person and being a unique person.
I really appreciate that data has come up a few times because it's really important for the decisions to be population data-led, understanding the population that we're serving, and then also data-led in terms of their efficacy and in terms of interpreting what need to be addressed. It's a really tricky topic in some ways. You know, it's two men interviewing two women. That's something that is not lost on me. But I want to make sure that hopefully we can be clear up front that we're absolutely coming at it from a feminist perspective.
I just find it fascinating because I've never, especially when it comes to evidence bases, I would look at the information and think, oh, well, that's the answer. Whereas what you're saying is it's not the information you're given, it's what information isn't there. What statistics aren't there, and it's those bits that are missing which are the most important to then feed into policy. I found it fascinating.
And even when we have data, so we know that Charlotte mentioned women earn less on average and are in need of affordable housing more likely at some point if they're caregivers to their children or to the family to even work part-time or not work at all. Yet I have not done extensive research to claim this, but anecdotally just looking, I haven't seen affordable policies that actually take into consideration that average household income is not really an average. That is potentially maybe a man earning, and then it does not take into consideration this nuanced fact.
There's another example of that as well, which is when we're building these urban extensions and they are based around cars, quite a lot of families can only afford to have one car. And so that one car gets given to the main breadwinner, and that's a man. And there are reports of women being trapped on estates because the infrastructure hasn't been provided yet. And they're waiting for that bus to be provided. They're waiting for that bike lane, or they're waiting for what they consider to be a safe path. They're waiting for those other sort of infrastructure needs to be near to them. Otherwise, they're trapped at home until their partner comes home because they can't afford another car. Women are less likely to own cars as well. There's all these different things where we're just like, oh, they just drive, or lots of people have two-person households with two cars, or whatever. I just think, like you're saying, we're generalising a lot. And I think the main thing with planning policy in the UK, and probably mainly in England, is that it is written as if it is gender neutral, that there are no different experiences. And I think you can see that from the NPPF. It talks about ages and abilities in transport policy, but it doesn't talk about gender. And then it's sort of put in the PPG in the January 2026 consultation, and it's very sporadic. And so when we do the profile of the area, the description of the place, we're not even saying how many women there are, what the population is in each local plan. And so we're just almost forgetting that there is a range of users that we are planning for.
Absolutely right. And there is a lot of practical application of gender equality, or however we're going to call it. I think we're still struggling to actually coin the term that we all agree on. There is a common practice in some countries, like in Austria, in Vienna, in Scandinavian countries. Spain is huge. But in the UK context, because it's obviously very context specific, we didn't know what actually means planning for women and girls. But I was working for LDC in my past life. I was a team lead in planning policy, and this is pretty much where in 2021 I started looking into the topic of gender equality in urban planning. And LDC truly has pioneered this topic in the UK. We had gender and women written into the policy, but we didn't know what that means. So effectively, we were saying, well, you need to create the places to be accessible and equitable for women and girls, but we didn't know in practice really what that means. And this is where our work in 2021 started, which is actually to define the practice of urban planning for gender equality. Because adding just words, it's very important in planning policy because this is your hook. And without it, it's hard to deliver anything, because obviously then you can argue with developer, etc. You're giving material consideration to these important issues. LDC looked into that and co-created the processes with women and girls. We took us 4 years of researching, collecting evidence base. So we were actually engaging with over 1,000 women and girls to understand what are their needs.
Yeah.
But in terms of just understanding what the issues are, We then moved to looking at the solutions, and today we actually know what that means. We actually have all of the practices written in the most kind of like applicable way possible.
I'm really glad you mentioned the LLDC Guidance Handbook, which is a supplementary guidance document for creating places that work for women and girls. I encourage everybody to check it out.
This is the author.
I wonder if we can start at the national policy context, because I think, Marina, you made a really excellent point that that's the hook. That's the starting point from which all of these different channels are going to flow. And there was a little bit of that drama we mentioned earlier with the NPPF. Anna Sabine, MP, was speaking to these concerns about the MHCLG not being keen to incorporate gender-specific wording into some of the draft policies. You mentioned the transport policy, and I think that that is, to my view, quite an easy win, right, to put that in. But again, I'm going to do this from that technocratic nerd perspective, so you'll definitely be aware, but just to make sure the readers are all up on this, the NPPF has two functions, right? One is to guide plan making, and one is to guide decision taking. And if we start with the plan making part of it, I'm keen for your thoughts on how an expectation in the NPPF to consider sex equity would ultimately look in a local plan context. So what would the evidence be to an officer for them to say, right, okay, I have that in the planning record, that I have comfort that that's been assessed, or that I've spoken to the right people, or that this feature on the drawing is related to that specific need for a specific part of the population?
Yeah, so I think in the NPPF, what we've been talking about with the data is there are two areas that need to be included. There's lots of things around evidence base, so aka the data that you need, the evidence that you need. And I think Marina and I both agreed that one of the easiest things to do is to say that you should include demographic data about everybody. So it is intersectional, it includes all marginalised groups. And it includes everybody. We're not trying to exclude anyone's experience. And where that might show, what that might look like is, for instance, if we're talking about an open space strategy, that when you're going out and commissioning that, you ask for that demographic data. And some of that demographic data will be quantitative, but some of it will still be qualitative. So it's kind of embedding community engagement as a second point throughout everything. Every time you do one of these studies, there's usually some form of community engagement in it. There's usually some form of engaging people, understanding how they're using the parks or how they're using playing pitches, etc. You know, and we're just saying that that should include different demographic data so we can understand where there might be specific nuances. And then I think this helps with decision making. Just to think back to that. At the moment, and this is what the NPPF decision making bit is sort of responding to, there are a lot of repetitive policies.
Yeah.
Across the whole of England, across the whole of London. And I think some of that comes down from not collecting very specific data and not actually knowing when you're looking at, say, like your employment land study and the statistics behind that. You're looking at average earnings, but are you actually looking to see if there is an issue for women in that particular area? Like how many women are out of work versus how many men? Is it a problem? If it's not, great. One of the best evidence bases where you start to see this is your joint strategic need assessment. We like a long thing, which is the public health evidence base that should sit behind every local plan. And public health actually are way ahead of planning in this. And actually we need to align a bit more. Public health will know everything. It will understand how a place is impacting every different demographic. And that's how we know that women are living longer. And that's actually how we might know that there is a very specific sort of health issue that is affecting men of a certain age and ethnicity or something. They will know that down to a ward code, probably. And they have statisticians in their teams that go through this. They're very, very evidence-led, very thorough. It gets peer-reviewed, etc. And they know all of that. And so they can be very specific with their targeted interventions and preventions. And they'll tell you what they need around housing specifically based on that. It's then how we translate that into planning.
Which is also kind of my question as well. The public health perspective reminds me back to John Snow and the Broad Street Pump, right? The study that birthed both planning and epidemiology. And I could understand why that level of statistical data is really important for epidemiology. For planning, you mentioned disparities in unemployment, and we can use that as an example, or if you have another example in mind.
Housing is easier. And I think actually, coming back to John Snow,
OG.
Yeah, the OG and the pump in Soho and just all of that. Because you have to remember actually that all of those public health bodies are actually local authorities now. It's literally like the whole system that we operate all comes back from all of that. But I think if you think about it now, how different is the situation if you really think about it? If you think about how poor some of the housing quality is that we've got in the UK, is it actually that much different to what we were dealing with then? But I'm also thinking about permitted development rights, how we allowed stuff with no windows. And I'm thinking about this based off some research that's coming out of UCL, which is looking at the health impacts of permitted development. I don't know how far Ben Clifford's research is through yet, but Terminus House it's in Harlow, isn't it? So I think that there are lots of single mothers living in there with their families in one room. Mm-hmm. Is that much different to some of the conditions in the Victorian age? It's like modern slums.
Yeah, and then you've got the emergency housing, which doesn't need to meet any kind of standards because it's emergency housing.
And there's so many people on a waiting list who are homeless. So there was a campaign at UK Reef by Creators Group, and it was saying, I think, almost 200,000 children are homeless or in temporary accommodation. I could have got that stat wrong from Nick Kilby's work. But that's not that different to some of the things that were going on in the Industrial Revolution. And I think we do need to start seeing it as bleak as that. And then there is a gender dynamic to that.
Yes, I completely agree. The housing stock in the UK is aging. It is not being replenished. It is not being replaced on a side-by-side basis, and it is not built for purpose for a modern climate crisis or a standard of living where heating is actually quite expensive. There's a question that comes to mind, though, which is whether that is not a problem to solve in its own right. And we can understand that it may disproportionately affect women, but is that not a problem for everybody?
The point here we're actually discussing today, we're not saying designing for gender equality is designing specifically and only for women and girls. We are just saying that we need to give consideration because gender inequality is a real thing. But the outcome is the better places for everyone. And again, there is no one thing here that we will say, this is something entirely new. You never heard of this practice, or you need to. It's not inventing anything new. It is giving consideration to the real issue. Talking about NPPF, 100% agree with Charlotte, what she was saying. I would even go a step further. I wouldn't, crucially, importantly, only say that gender disaggregated data is the key. I would say implementing gender transformative practices or gender informed, effectively just saying that once you have the data, you need to do something with it. You actually need to prove what are you doing through policy, through every single application. Yeah. So side-by-side basis strategically. So one thing is understanding the problem. Another thing is addressing the problem and then monitoring how are you improving the situation. And this is the practice of creating places for women and girls, also known as gender transformative urban planning or gender informed.
Gender sensitive.
As well,
there's lots of names for it. Yeah, and we're constantly evolving what we think it is.
We're talking about interchangeably gender sensitive, gender informed, gender transformative is something that I like to use. I like to use this one because I was at a World Urban Forum 2 years ago and also working for the UN. Within the global discourse is being called gender transformative because the focus is on changing the system. It's on the outcome. It's not about being sensitive, being informed. It is changing what we know is the problem.
I think gender transformative planning is actually probably the next version of what we're going to start using because you're right. It's about acting on it. I think in the UK, I know you've got the handbook at LLDC, but there was another handbook through the Greater London Council in the 1980s called Changing Places, which I have on my bookshelf at home. I still think, we don't know what it looks like now, even though we've got the wonderful work you're doing, the stuff that's happening in Glasgow with the feminist city, where they're still finding their way, what a feminist city looks like. I'm keen to see some of the things out of that. Now Edinburgh is doing the same, and then we're going to get a new planning policy in Leeds City Council. But it's almost seeing what comes out of the handbook, what the examples. I know there were some examples from the GLA where they were doing some test beds, weren't they, with Ellie Cosgrave at Publica, what it actually looks like.
Did I tell you I'm doing the toolkit for Glasgow?
Feminist. No, but you just told the podcast. Well, you need to do that properly. So
we just got commissioned to do. I'm doing with May East and 360 Architects. Glasgow has moved quite a lot. So Glasgow, for those who are not aware, is the first feminist city due to Councillor Holly Bruce passing a motion to declare Glasgow as a feminist city, including mainstreaming the practice of gender transformative urban planning. And yeah, I'm very happy to be part of the team that is going to develop the handbook or a toolkit for feminist urban planning. This is going to answer through the process of planning. How do you ensure that gender equality is mainstream and embedded in the decision making and design?
We'll be right back. At Centro, our tailored approach turns potential into planning permission for major development projects nationwide. Every project is unique, and our analytical and persuasive approach delivers the best possible results for our clients. Our team's diverse insights are essential to creative problem solving, and together, we're proud to plan for a sustainable future. Get in touch if we can help. Find us on LinkedIn and online at centroplan.co.uk. That is fantastic. And I think it's good to have that visibility. And all cities should be feminist cities. If somebody or if a city government doesn't believe in the social and economic and cultural equity between sexes and advancing towards that where it's not happening, then they need to grow up, right? That's just insane. But I guess, again, I'm still stuck on the sort of technocratic part of it, trying to understand what would the case be to explain to somebody who agrees with all of the interventions, for example, but then says, is sex here not just a pass filter through which we're looking at something that affects more people? Do you know what I mean? If we go to the LLDC guidance, there's a really helpful summary of 10 possible interventions: lighting, security and surveillance, nature and planting, mobility infrastructure, maintenance and monitoring, wayfinding. Those are all good things, but they're good urban design principles, sort of full stop. What do we learn about then going into the data behind different experiences and gender? I'm really not trying to push the envelope, but
No, not at all.
if you're loving it, I'm fascinated.
I think you're asking the right question.
Yeah, I'm happy you mentioned that. I'll try to give an example because I feel like where people really get stuck is actually understanding what is it, right? Like, come on, just tell us what we need to do.
I'm really not trying to be obtuse.
No. This is
It's a normal answer to
absolutely normal. It was the question I had when I started working on this. And I was quite unsure myself. When we started working on the handbook, the original idea was to create a design guidance because we all want to hear a set of design principles, right? We're planners, designers. And we started by doing that. And then you understand when you start looking into and digging through the topic and actually speaking with women and girls is there's no set of design principles that you can simply just apply. I wish it could be as easy as, I don't know, put the bench here and change the light to this lux level and there is no gender inequality. I mean, that would be a dream to fix it so easily, right? Yeah. Gender inequality is a systemic and structured issue. And that's why it requires process and systemic change. Mm-hmm. The basic principle is about the process. And that means what we were saying, collecting gender desegregated data, informing your policies to respond to those issues because those issues are also very context specific. So I can't tell you do this because it will really be different from street to street, from area to area. So that's why the process is very important. I mean, in a basic terms would be required that where you know that there are particular issue in your area, required the change, right? We mentioned some of the things in relationship to whatever data shows, right? Mm-hmm. Again, can't speculate what that can be. And then on a plot by plot basis, obviously needs to be proportionate. You're not going to be asking this every development to do.
Thank you.
Engage with women and girls through the participation and learn through their lived experience. The more importantly is to say, how did you respond to their needs? And again, you will come back to the basic design principles. They're not going to tell you anything that you wouldn't do anyway, but they will bring the local knowledge and they will bring their needs. And not only their needs, when you consult with women and girls, you would first hear about the needs of their family, of their caregivers, of their husband, of their community, and as well of themselves, right? Mm-hmm. So then just be mindful of those needs and then just ensure that your design is responding to those needs. That can be, whether it's a need for lighting, whether it's a need for wayfinding, I mean, wayfinding, for example, also can be a difference in how women needs to know, for example, the time that it's going to take. So the decision they're going to make, particularly at night, let's say, whether they're going to take one street or another street. So these are, for example, some nuances. So, I mean, again, design solution is going to be just responding to those needs. And it's a process. And then once development or a developer and the client's team does that part, we would expect development officers to assess that, write into their reports, and then everyone in the process has kind of like asked the same question, which is like, who is disadvantaged and how do we address that? So that is the process part, right?
Yes.
And then when it comes to the specific design solutions, again, that can really be varied. And I will give an example just to help with this. At LDC, as one of the projects, as we started looking into this topic, we went to revisit one of our design solutions, which was, I think, in outline permission for a play space for teenagers, right? Because at the time, I mean, LDC is really progressive and has very talented people. So we thought, okay, teenagers are usually designed out of our public spaces. So we're going to create the places for teenagers. Mm-hmm. But we did this before we'd done the work on gender. So we went back to revisit this design as we were talking with women and girls. We actually realized that even illustration of the play space only included boys playing, because there was a basketball court, there was a football pitch, and the girls were maybe sitting somewhere near those courts and just hanging and looking. So we kind of, thought, okay, what did we do wrong here? So we went back to the very same group of teenagers that helped us to co-design this with us, but we only spoke with teenage girls. And we went back with them with a very different question, which was like, would you use this space? And they said no. We were like, yeah, but why? I was like, well, there's nothing in here for us. So this was a major lesson learned. It's not only co-designing and engaging, it is who you are designing for and what question are you asking. So then we isolated a group of teenage girls, and because they're not conditioned to think about their needs and there's no relevant examples, we could not co-design with them, but we brought them in as a co-client. So you really need to be very creative in a way you're engaging with a certain group, particularly the one that you don't have presidents out there to simply just say, oh, what do you like? Or to know what their needs are. Many sessions forward, we have created a place that responded to their needs. One of the things, again, looking at the solutions, was they needed to know where is the nearest toilet, what is the opening hour of the nearest toilet, and to imagine and know from the information board, what is that journey possibly look like? Is it lit? So that they can inform their decisions before they make the journey to the toilet. Is it going to be open? Do I need to go with someone? Etc. How long is it going to take me to go and come back? So then this is a very specific design solution that you want to then implement. And this is being gender transformative, or maybe in this case, gender informed.
When I first read the design documents, I read as a face value and saw the key design principles. And I thought, they just look like really good design principles. But it's what you're saying, that the final output isn't what you're looking at. That's just high level purposely. Whereas what you should be looking at is what goes on behind the scenes. What are the granular conversations that need to be had to refine those high level principles?
It is most likely that you will end up with the good design principles. Again, there's no one design principle here that is entirely new, unheard of. But you just need to be sure that that is responding to the needs of those who you're designing for. And that's why this idea of just writing a set of design principles does not work. Because also, everyone likes to be a little lazy and just give me a solution and I apply. But you can't, because we did it actually. When we were doing evidence-based, we came as a very broad principle, which is right, which is women like to look outwards. They need to see who is coming. And then we apply that principles just bluntly, as it is, into the space where we turn these benches outwards. But the space was already very open. So it was very weird that you had this bench looking into a road when the whole space is big. So it does, right? It's very context specific. And that's why I'm saying, I would not give design principles because people can apply them bluntly. But if you go through the process and you learn the principles, and then you go and for that very location with those very people, you have a conversation, then you'll have a certainty of what a good design for that place, for those people would look like.
There's so much nuance to it. So the wayfinding example is really helpful. I was thinking about it in terms of like TfL wayfinding, which is just really good, but it's not like this is a lighted path. You know, it'll give you maybe the minute times, but not the experiential kind of journey of a path.
I was going to say, though, those are very like urban design specific things. And I don't think we're there on sort of maybe some of the other planning policy areas. I feel like on the urban design stuff to do with transport, public realm, public space, it's easy to get to grips with, and we all feel more comfortable with that. I think when you start talking about the economic and employment stuff, it is harder, and we've stopped doing social regeneration, I would say, as a country, and we focus on physical regeneration, and that's a whole different other topic, and that it needs to come hand in hand with planning in terms of that, and it's probably more around Section 106 opportunities and making sure that you're actually tailoring them to what your local population needs rather than blunt tools that we have at the moment. But I think it's housing. I think it's about thinking about affordable housing and thinking about what the priority there is. Are there really specific groups that needs to be responding to in areas, which is very difficult in the current planning policy situation that we have?
Yeah.
Or like if you're going to do older people's housing, and I'm thinking of the development in Barnet, the older women's housing sort of cooperative that lived together on an old house site in Barnet. They bought it, took them ages to get it, and they've created a community for themselves where they've got some affordable housing, they've got flats, they can live and eat together because they want to, because they feel safer together. Mm-hmm. That should be sort of part of your evidence finding for your older people's housing need, maybe in an area where you've got an elderly population. If it's more likely to be women, okay, well, how do you want to live in the future? And then that also then probably helps us get them out of the house that they're in, that they're rattling around in on their own, and then releases that back into the market.
100%. I'm glad, Charlotte, you're bringing this back to housing, because the examples that I've given very rightly are about public spaces, and we understand that, and we're way more comfortable. So the work we did, it was around public spaces,
it
but
makes sense.
We need to move on. Also, we've done the work with WSP on climate and gender, and it was mind-blowing when you start actually collecting the data and lived experience and looking what it means intersect between climate change and gender from the perspective of designing cities. But yeah, the housing super important. And just to say that for those who are interested looking into this topic, Spain is doing amazing work in this space. So it's not impossible. It's not abstract. Actually, it can be delivered as a policy, as a design guideline on the national level, policy on the local level. And I think it's definitely something to see as a good example.
I think the difference in context, though, there, Marina, is that, yes, there is gender mainstreaming at a national level, but then they have the ability at, say, like a Barcelona or Madrid level to set their own, like, laws. And I think that's where it differs. And it's actually, I think that is probably, as much as I think it should be a national planning policy, and I'm not trying to contradict myself, I do actually feel like through mayoral combined authorities and through the GLA and through some of the local government reorganisation, that actually that is where lots of this stuff will start to happen. Because like we've had it in the GLA, like one of the things that they did is there is another sort of handbook that sits alongside the LLDC on a greater London like level called Safer Public Space for Women and Girls and Gender Diverse People, and it's written by Ellie Cosgrove, and it's from the regeneration team, so it's sort of one of those material consideration guidances. But the phase 2 of that was actually funding actual projects to see what it looked like on the ground, which some of the LLDC stuff was, I think one of the LLDC projects was one of the ones they funded. So they're testing it, and I feel like the mayoral authorities will have more money or more powers to use their money in that way to start to think about this in practical terms or implement it in their own developments as they sort of start to do them.
I keep thinking about it in terms of like national policy and then local policy and the decision making, but so many of the ways that we're looking at it can't be isolated into those tidy categories. The transport example that you mentioned, Charlotte, about how people commute and whether it's a 3-stop journey or it's a hub and spoke to the city centre and back on a train kind of thing is really interesting. And that then makes me think about local government, because local governments in Greater London love the overground because it has orbital and sort of lateral journey potential for people who aren't just going into Zone 1. And then we come back to national policy and where that could potentially fit into the NPPF with a sort of broader question of how much local authorities are currently thinking about this now. How much do they need to be pushed by the NPPF? And there are a lot of ways that I think local authorities could benefit from a little push by the NPPF. But are they not thinking about this already?
So I think it does need to be a national policy to make them do this. And I think we can see from Karen's research that it's not evident in local plans. But I think, Marina, you've been doing some stuff with Dr. Karen Hallwood at the moment, like looking at this in more detail.
Yeah, Karen and I had an exact question. Okay, so now we know what to do. Is it being done? And if not, why not? Leeds Beckett University did a little research. I was collaborating on this to effectively ask all local authorities if they're familiar of the topic, if they are they applying it in practice, and if not, what are the key barriers? Preliminary results, a report is to come out hopefully in the next 1 month. What we've seen, kind of like only 7% said that they've never heard of it, but not everyone engaged with it. Like it's familiar of the topic, but it's not something that they apply in a daily work, or they do apply, but through the principles of good design, right? So it's not specifically being used as we were discussing here.
It's just not that lens necessarily, but they're thinking about lateral trips that don't go into the city centre. That kind of thing.
The other things, so kind of like in general. And I think what was really important, we did not ask for this, but we obviously left it open and just kind of like a question. And what was really, really interesting is that overwhelming majority of those who responded said that this topic is great, but it's really hard at the local level if this is not a priority at the national level, because local authorities fear that even when it comes to public examination and inspector, that they won't have a lot of ground to fight for this, because there is obviously a lot more other priorities. So how they give this a priority in conversation for the adoption of the local plans, but also, and more importantly, when they sit in front of developers. Yeah. So again, everyone understood the importance.
But I think that also speaks to something else, which is that the NPPF is very specific now on what you can and can't do in a local plan. And, and I think sometimes thinking about being to a local plans officer and team leader, like you have to have really clear conversations with everybody, like especially with the community, about what it does and doesn't allow you to do and where they can actually shape things. I am 100% behind the fact that it does need to be included in there, but just not only focus on safety.
In a sort of operational sense, that kind of iterative feedback can create data collection, but then also data collection with lenses of intersectionality that then can shape policies. That's really, really helpful. Where I'm still sweating in my palms a little bit is how then that looks in a policy. Because, of course, the policies are going to be there to state an intention, but what they're really doing in a reactionary plan-led system is putting some kind of expectation on the developer. And when the local authority is sitting across from a developer, it's not my client, it's me. I'm kind of thinking of it in two ways. One, I don't want to be like coded as low-key misogynistic if I'm sitting across from somebody and they're saying, well, you've just not convinced me that this is sex equitable.
I don't think it's for you to say that. I think the policy should be saying, in this area, we know that women need this or men need that. And therefore, we would prefer if you prioritised this. Or in this area, say like in Waltham Forest, we used to divide the borough into north, central and south. So say in central, there are more Bengali women. So you need to make sure that you actually heed them the sort of respect, and you include them in your consultation that they need to be one of the targeted areas. The policy should be nuanced enough or should be specific enough that it's telling you that there are some areas that are a priority. There are some areas that you should target. And then, like with everything, it's a balance, it's a negotiation. You might not be able to do it. I'm still saying it's very difficult, but it should be like, you should know that in this particular area, if you're doing play space, that more girls live in that area. So your play space strategy might be slightly different and you need to go and speak to them. And this is the best way to do it.
Gotcha. Okay.
Do you know, that's how I see it. That doesn't exist yet, but that's how I see it happening. But I mean, I'm also an armchair planner now, guys. I don't actually do any proper planning anymore.
It's pretty grotty down in the trenches right now.
Yeah, no.
Yes. It is toxic.
But it's not.
AF.
It is really bad at the moment. The viability is plummeting. But it doesn't feel like those issues are things that planning can solve. But I think some of the things that we're asking for is actually, if you're going to spend the money on the stuff that actually counts and spend the money on the stuff that's actually going to make a difference. And the policy planners need to get sharper in their asks.
If I can just try to make sure I have this clear in my head, because when we talk about policy, there are different kinds of policy.
I mean, in a local plan.
Oh, no, I know. Yeah. Sorry. But yes, local plan policy, but there are different types. A policy can set procedural expectations, right? We want you to talk to the Bangladeshi women in this area, right? I'm all for that because A, it's going to be responding to that intersectional data, but B, it's going to just let me know what is expected of me. Another kind of policy, though, can be the demonstrate to us that this is sufficient, that it's gender inclusive. That is a lot more difficult. There's always the discretion, and it's always just about the development plan in the round. But when I say that things are kind of toxic down in the trenches, what I mean is that often decision makers feel like they're not standing up for the public interest unless they actually insist on some kind of theoretical perfection for each policy expectation.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of a challenge there. And then also in terms of policy for outcomes, by all means, you can look at an authority in sub areas and say, here, we do want to prioritize having a separate kitchen from a living room because of family's size or the cuisine. And that makes a lot of sense to me. Like all of these kinds of little nuances that are actually really helpful. It's how the policy is written then that is really going to matter a lot, because a lot is just sort of put down as, these are good things, do it. And it's like, well, but how do you want me to do that?
Yeah, no, and I get that. And I don't think this will necessarily go in all of the policies either. So I think there'll be things that should be location specific and sit in those location policies based on that demographic and what might be a priority, because, we said Bangladeshi, but like...
Shout out to our hamlets.
Yeah, whatever it is, you should talk to that specific demographic. But then I think there will be thematic policies where it sits in, like we've talked about open space. I mean, there is a massive issue with playing pitch strategies and how much heedance we give them. And when you actually look at the sex disaggregated data there, it is based on male sports. Shout out to Susanna Walker from In Her Place, who's done a lot of research on this, and especially looking at it when she was at Make Space for Girls. But it is like 70% plus, like all for men. So it's football. Yeah. And then and all of everything is around providing for those existing people that use it and users, and they're mainly male. But then I don't think you're going to get necessarily, like, when you're saying you don't want to necessarily have an argument about whether you've been gender informed enough. What are you thinking about? Like, I could see that happening maybe with a loss of like a women's centre, and like you haven't considered their needs. And I could see.
Oh, that would be quite straightforward.
Yeah. But like, there's public sector equality duty, right? And like this thing that happened in Haringey where you had to like consider everybody. But I'm trying to think of the policy.
I need to come to this and defend policy planning, because I spend most of my life doing exactly that. I mean, planning policy was never meant to give you specifically for every site, unless it's a site allocation, into a little bit more detail, what are the needs, etc. But it's impossible to tell you exactly what you need to do. It sets the principles which are relevant to the local area, which are evidence-led, right? What we were saying previously. And then I think I would say it's a skill set of your consultants, your office, to then know how to apply that. And I would say maybe one of the most pragmatic advice would be have a dedicated gender equality champion who is just going to read the literature that was mentioned and understand the topic, and then be able to actually help you to answer these questions and have these conversations. I mean, ideally, the conversation and the expertise would sit at the both sides of the table, so local authority and client's team. But yeah, at the end of the day, it is, more simple than that.
I do see where you're coming from, and this is an important point that relates to planning writ large as much as it does to any specific policy area. The way that you're describing it, that's how it's meant to work. And we do read all the guidance. We do understand the issues at play. The way that it plays out, though, is sometimes, and actually, unfortunately, often a lot more toxic than that. And so discretion is used as a weaponized tool. So somebody is unhappy about the viability situation that's crippled Greater London's housing delivery, well, that's everyone's number one priority until it ends up coming at the end of the process after everything else has been gold-plated. But where there is discretion, there is weaponization. And I think it's really difficult to separate just setting an expectation on the developer to like read up. Because like, I agree, right? When we should be read up on all of our things. But when it creates yet another policy area where somebody can say, you know, they just don't like it. And then they say, well, I'm sorry, I'm just not convinced. That type of dynamic. We're like, well, I think there's going to be some heritage harm. Or like, well, I just don't think that the sense of arrival's been corrected enough. The disconnect between how planning is designed to work and meant to work, and then where the onus falls onto the applicant to prove to them, creates this really, really ugly power dynamic.
Yeah, I understand what you mean by discretion, and I sort of understand both points, because I think, although I'm saying be specific, I mean, it would still be, so, you know, these are the priority areas as of this time, but you might need to update that evidence and do your own work. And I agree with that. And I find this, whether that is a consultant or a development management person, that sometimes there needs to, and it comes down to resourcing, and it comes down to time, it comes down to cost and stuff. But sometimes I think there does need to be some responsibility on that side of the profession to actually use their planning, you know, skills and technocratic sort of skills in it, and actually interpret it and understand it and, you know, be creative sometimes. But I do get that, you know, I'm not au fait with discretion being weaponized in quite that way. But I mean, I haven't worked as a planning consultant, and I don't think I was a particularly good one with Andrew, who on this podcast since
I think you're impeccable.
2015,
2013, but we're not.
No, but that's when you started, and I'd been there in 2012. But I think I stopped being a planning consultant in about 2015, where I was doing anything that was billable. So I'm not really at that hard-nosed end of it, but I can see like that it's going to be one of those things that either it's weaponized, you've not done it properly if it's a political priority. So say there is a borough that wants to be the first feminist borough or whatever, and it's a really big priority for them. Or like, you know, it's going to be, this is a nice to have, and there are other things that we need to focus on. And so it gets pushed down the list. And I think that's the problem when it maybe becomes like a separate policy. Some councils are going down the route of just having a gender policy, and then it only really focuses on urban design and safety. And I think that's about it being woven in and why it needs to be in the evidence base. But yeah, it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because everything comes down to viability. And that's why I'm saying if affordable housing is going to be the priority, if that affordable housing in that area needs to be focused on a certain demographic, then it should be. And it's actually, and our planning system doesn't allow for that anymore. And my understanding is, being friends and related to lots of older planners from many generations ago, that perhaps maybe we used to be much more specific in like our site allocations, where we would say that this needs to be specifically for X, Y, and Z. And that perhaps we've gone a bit general with everything.
You mentioned viability, and everything is through that lens. I think I would also suggest that from the agent's perspective, from the developer's perspective, everything is through the lens of documentation and evidence.
Okay, fine. Yeah.
Right. So we can say, well, we've looked at the data and how it breaks down in terms of intersectionality through these different design principles. Here's what we've been able to present. Here's where we've considered the wayfinding or the lighting or the position of the seating, all of these different things. Here's who we've talked to.
Yeah.
And I get that like, it doesn't make a lot of sense to have an additional like gender report, right?
Well, I don't know. Like Arup, that's what Arup suggests actually for, what is it called? Designing cities that work for women and girls with the UN and University of Liverpool. They talk about having a gender audit. But again, I still think that's from a local plan perspective and not necessarily on an application by application basis. But maybe it's about tweaking things again. Maybe it's about adding a bit into a design and access statement where it actually says that you've done this, or these are some of the considerations that we've put in based on our talking to women and girls. I don't ever think we never advocate for necessarily whole systems change with the approach to like planning. I think it's about integrating it and mainstreaming it into all considerations. And if that means that certain things that we're already doing need to have that lens added to it, then they should, if it's missing.
From a values perspective, I completely agree.
Yeah, but
from that evidence lens, it's sort of like, does it become a tick box? And of course, we don't want that. We don't want it to just be like this virtue signal. How do we have the comfort that we know we're satisfying an officer's expectation on this kind of issue?
But then it's also, for me, it's all down to viability, where there's always give and take. There's always compromises to be made. And it could be, we can't do this, but we are giving you a lovely multi-use games area, or we are giving 35%. So if I was a planning officer, what would I look to prioritise if ultimately the councillors wanted one thing, but I can see that this isn't being met in another area?
Having worked at local authority, it's about understanding the need and who you're designing for, and knowing maybe even better than local authority sometimes at that very site, because obviously local authority can't know to that granular level, is understanding and convincing that this is the best solution their people need. And I think that comes to what we were saying before. If you do your research, if you understand these principles, we're talking about gender, let's say, as one, right, element, if you understand it and you understand who is the demographic, you understand what are their needs, what is their lived experience, and you go back with a scheme that meets that, I would be very surprised to hear someone not liking it. I mean...
Well, given the current politics of the UK, who knows these days? I agree with you to some extent, but I guess, yeah, it is difficult, isn't it? Because it does get weighed out in the balance. It is the planning balance. But the thing is, if we think what are other things in planning that are similar, I do come back to health and well-being. And some of that may be, doing a health impact assessment. I worked on those types of policies before, and I'm slightly cynical about how successful a health impact assessment
we can talk
is.
about that, Charlotte.
Yeah, but again, I do think if you're going to use it, that is probably, gender is already in that.
It is.
So, there are already things that we are doing. I just think there are areas where we're not considering this. And as much as we have got examples of things in public safety, I don't think we know what this looks like in the current system that we've got at the moment. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. And so it might be that we fail a bit. If we can get the first basic steps of at least getting it into all evidence bases, so at least we understand the issue, then we can start, because we can't actually come up with loads of the policy solutions at the moment, because we don't actually know. We've only got sort of our gut feeling on some of these things, or general statistics. And I think that's the same around things that get invented around sort of climate change policies and going beyond building regulations, or the viability approaches. Those are all being based on somebody looking at the evidence and going, okay, well, this is the way that we deal with this. Or this is the political priority. How do we build this into a local plan? It's going to take time to come up with some of the solutions.
Yeah.
And absolutely. And that's why I focus on process. And we need to reiterate the process as we learn. It's about as well monitoring the impact, because we're not going to get everything right. It's a new practice, not a new topic at all, unfortunately. Yeah. But it's a new practice, and we need to reiterate the process.
Yeah, and you proved that with the LLDC, that you did a project, you went back to it, and you were like, okay, we need to change things next time. I know we're in a sticky situation with viability and development in this country, but we don't want another race to the bottom, like we had maybe from 2008 onwards sometimes. And so if we can do some of these things and bake them in, and just, like I said, if we're going to spend money, if we're going to do things, can we try and be a bit more targeted and a bit more specific? And can local authorities be more specific in their asks, but also can developers push back by being more specific with the evidence that they've got?
So is it more, because I fully agree that it shouldn't be the job of policy to say exactly what you should be providing and when, because that's not going to be accurate. So are you advocating more that the policy says you need to consider gender transformity in more detail, and then the onus is then on the developer to bring the information the council need in order to convince them the developer's done the homework, and then that the developer themselves has designed it in response to that?
Personally, I'd like the idea that it's gathered and presented at plan making stage and incorporated into the policy expectations.
I think it should be baked in at a local plan stage. But what I would hope now with digitally enabled or technologically enabled or data enabled planning is that it might be live data. So there might be a dashboard of the local plan, because local plans are supposed to be digital now. So it might be a dashboard, and it might be that data is updated live, and therefore you're just taking it off of that. That is the hope in all of this digital planning.
Yeah.
local planning thing. You should have maps. They should have gender layers. In the same way you have indices of deprivation, you should have different layers over things of understanding of data. But it might be live data that is available through the digital planning process, we would hope.
Ideally, yes, you would have local planning authority doing its work and giving you tools, helping you and the data and understanding. And I will give an example because that's exactly what we did at LDC. We went and spoke, as I mentioned, with over 1,000 women and girls. So we've done the survey, street interviews, co-creation, all of the things. So we had a map exactly knowing which streets and places and roads and where women and girls felt unsafe or where they felt safe. And we started understanding what makes the place feel one or another. And we had this underpass, of course, which obviously overwhelmingly was marked as unsafe. So we had an application for student housing. Mm-hmm. Our policy, obviously, as you know, required by London, was that you place that in the local centres, metropolitan centres, or if it's walking distance from the HEI, higher education institution.
Yeah.
So we had this site, and obviously you would know that now UCL East and many universities are on the park. And it was a good argument that this site sort of like, you know, gives the vibrancy and, you know, there were some benefits to locating student accommodation there. We also know, and this is gender transformative planning, we also know that majority of students are young women. That's the statistic, right? The site, they were saying that it's a walking distance to the university, but we knew that that's not true because we knew that at least women or young girls would not walk that way. And if they're taking the longer route, it's not anymore whatever perimeter was, like 10, 15 minutes. It was half an hour. So again, you know, right, you're not meeting the policy. Now, of course, you always look for solution in planning as well. So we negotiated with the developer to get Section 106 money beyond the red line, no pun intended. We negotiated that certain money was given towards the project that we were already doing to improve the underpass, because that would unlock this connectivity and then the site will be policy compliant. So this is what we are actually talking about. So you would want to know the local authority has the information and that you are coming together to solve the issue, to improve and make the places better for everyone, and then adding that layer of gender.
That's really helpful as an example to sort of illustrate sort of a case study.
To me, that's a good example. That to me makes a lot of sense because it reminds you of similar applications where the council asks for 106 money, for instance, for step-free access because they know a scheme is going to generate more people going towards a certain station. So it's useful in that respect because it frames the argument a bit better and makes you understand that if the council have the information, they can present that information to the applicant and the applicant can then respond to it.
Yeah, because it will be very hard for a developer to know that level of detail, right, across the broader area. I mean, you should understand where your residents or occupants are, what their lived experience looks like.
Yeah.
And build based on that. But of course, you know, you would expect that it's from both sides.
The LODC's information, was that publicly available?
Of course, yeah.
That's interesting. Okay.
That is a really helpful case study in sort of showing how this works well when there's that opportunity. Is there some kind of space between this really lovely example and I totally get it and I'm on board and it was a success story through and through, between that and like me filling out an HIA pro forma like a jackass saying like, how will this affect people of color? It won't. Like I don't know.
Well, yeah,
you know?
And you can see that in equalities impact assessments as well.
Yeah.
Like, but thinking of ones for policy, and they'll just say, you know, I've looked at some of these, and they say no impact, and you've just ticked a box.
Yeah.
Somebody has made a suggestion. Shout out to Robin Prince, who is part of Vistry in London. So she did her Future of London. So there's one I've done. It's like the junior leaders, but I think she was one of the senior leaders, one Leaders Plus or something. And they have to do a proposal for London. And her proposal, and Marina and I heard her speak about this on a webinar for the Women's Housing Forum, that actually some of this should actually sit within legislation around that you need to consult with women and girls as part of planning. So it should sit within the 2004 Act and all the things around statement of community involvement. And maybe that's where the requirement comes in. It actually sits in the statement of community involvement for a local authority under the bit where it relates to development management on applications over a certain size. You must make sure that you have included it, and then the evidence that you provide. And, there's always lots of negotiation around whether your statement of community involvement has actually truly engaged people.
Yeah. And this is where the discretion in policy thing is a bit of a recurring efficiency challenge and a recurring productivity challenge. Any kind of policy where there's just like a theoretical optimization that's expected, optimizing active frontage, optimizing embodied carbon impacts, optimizing, demolishing as little as possible of an existing building, optimizing community outreach, optimizing social equities. There are definitely situations that occur pretty frequently.
I think also, I would just say though, that you can only be gender informed, and even if you've done that, you can't do everything. And also within that, everyone has different sorts of experiences, don't they, or different perceptions. So when we talk about safety, it's a perception of safety, and the GLA guidance on this is very good, is that there is a spectrum and everybody will sit differently on a spectrum. So I like walking down high streets. I prefer that. If I feel unsafe or go into a corner shop, I'll buy like a Snickers. That way I know that person's seen me. Like, these are the things I do think about sometimes, but I always used to do that on the way home on one place that I lived. But other women like walking down empty streets, like down residential streets. I just think being a London, I just don't think anybody would open their door if I started screaming. I feel more unsafe there.
But are you essentially saying that it's less an expectation, it's gender compliant and more gender informed?
I think at this moment, I think so. And I think by being gender informed, some of it will be gender transformative. But as I keep saying, and I think it's really hard to have these hard-nosed development management conversations about it, I just feel where...
Thank you.
No, it is.
That's where we sit in the process.
No, and I think it is, because it's in its infancy. But I think we're almost like we did do a lot of this before, and lots of that stuff failed, and some of it sat outside of planning. So a lot of the stuff in the 80s was like, we need a women's only taxi service, or we need a women's shuttle bus that takes women from Bristol city centre to their homes, and it's only women in the minibus and things like that, which sit outside of planning and ultimately require quite a lot of money and things like that. So, we've done it before. It's not all massively worked. And I think we're trying again, and we're trying in a different system. I would say there are some things that are the same, but some things that are fundamentally different.
I'm really glad you came back to that, because you said earlier that this might work differently and it might work more cohesively if we didn't have the system that we do have. And it kind of ties into me on that development management, us versus them toxicity that I was talking about, being like, but what do you expect to be like another thing? And how do I evidence that? And how do I have the comfort that it won't be weaponized in decision making? And it ties into, Marina, your points from that placemaking perspective. If the state or the local government could have a greater role in land assembly, which arguably a development corporation is kind of that tool in the UK, then we could have a different conversation. If I'm thinking of like just a random brownfield site in Zone 2, I'm thinking, but have I done enough?
Yeah, I think some of this may start happening with the bigger schemes and the bigger developers, bigger players, because, I think things like, if you look at social impact funding that you get from some of the pension funds, like LNG, where they will specifically push some of their funding towards affordable housing projects and social value and ESG metrics and what they're being looked at, how they're being funded, and maybe thinking, those bigger institutional investors and developers are probably more likely to start this and start testing this and wanting to do it, because there are some more purpose-driven things. But asking like a random local developer to do it or how to do it is going to be more difficult. It's sort of like that thing with like large developers versus SMEs. And we just have to test and just see. I just think we don't know what this looks like. Also, talking about what it looks like in London, and this is a debate that me and Marina always have. I was like, first of all, is LLDC, it's a development corporation, so it's different. It's got the mayor, it's different. Then London is different. And then what is happening outside of London, again, is a very, very different conversation. We talk about viability in London, but if you think about like Newcastle, brownfield land is really, really difficult to deliver because of the history of mining. So you don't know if you're like building on solid ground. And so they're just like sometimes happy to get development, happy to get affordable housing and so on. So the situation and the approaches are like, what you can ask for in London, I feel, is very different to the rest of the country.
It used to be.
You don't think it is anymore?
Well, I mean, the residential part of the sector has collapsed.
Do you think that London is on the same basis, if not worse, than the rest of England at the moment?
In terms of
like viability and being able to live there? Because I'm guessing if the fire safety stuff is a huge issue, that if you're building single-storey houses outside London, that might be easier to some extent because it doesn't deal with...
The EUV is just vastly different, right? So existing use value. Okay. You also have that intersectionality, not sociologically, but physically with contamination.
Yeah.
You have the BSR, like you mentioned, and buildings are much more likely to meet that high-risk building threshold in terms of height, which then significantly cuts down on the net-to-gross ratio, arguably requiring things that don't even speak to what happened at Grenfell anyway. And then you also have just much more onerous policies. So one thing that the NPPF is doing is stripping out building regs excesses from local plans.
Yeah, I disagree with that approach, though.
Well,
For climate change specifically.
And you also have very experimental policies on things like climate change. And the episode that we did with James Mickleborough, who's an engineer in sustainability, it's one of those things that becomes planning's problem. You know, GP waiting times become planning's problem. All of these different things. And of course, there's a climate emergency. Of course, we need to build to use as little carbon as possible in the construction and in the operation of a building. And then when every single application is just do the best possible, but also that could just be a matter of professional difference in opinion as well, what that means relative to optimizing the site. These things do paralyze the process.
But I think that comes back to when we were originally talking about this and how do we understand how women experience places. And we're talking about it being systematic or systemic, like patriarchy, inequality. I agree with you to some extent that planning can become the sticking plaster. And Mike Kiley will always say planning should stick to the knitting. However, I think that's fine in terms of maybe decision-making side, but I think planning policy should be dealing with everything that spatial planning requires it to.
I do agree with that. My sort of protestation is about the way that the policies are worded then.
Yeah.
You know, so just set a standard and an expectation for embodied carbon, and then that's great.
Yeah.
But for every single redevelopment of every single brownfield site to need like 6 different version testings and calculations for this and that, it becomes really difficult, especially when there's necessarily expectation to meet. It's just sort of, well, I don't think that's enough.
Is your concern that, well, it's obviously it's a necessity to talk about gender specific and gender transformity, but worry that it's just another layer to an already complicated, expensive process, and at what point does it give?
Yeah, so I think what I was going to say back on what Aaron was saying about planning gets used as a sticking plaster, that it is a systemic issue. Some of these things should happen earlier in the process. I do sometimes think if we're thinking about gender at the planning process, we should be, but I also think sometimes that's too late. So another approach, it's more an onus on government, and we're putting all the onus on government today.
To be a government. Yeah, like, you know what I mean? Like,
we're just telling them they need to do everything. It's all their fault. They fix it all. But I do think there's something around like gender budgeting. And that is actually when you're looking at the financial decisions and the priorities you're making that you consider the gender dynamics. The London Assembly and TfL have actually said that they're going to look into gender budgeting around transport. So they're going to start to actually consider the gender lens of the decisions that they're making. It happens in lots of other countries. And I think actually when you talk about things, it is easier to talk about gender in terms of transport, I think, and public space and public realm. But so they're going to start doing that. It's cost benefit analysis, isn't it? So if you look at cost benefit analysis for transport, generally you find that people that drive are worth more than people that get on a train, in a taxi, on a bike, and then people that walk. Okay, so men are more likely to drive, women are more likely to walk. And actually thinking about how you make that value-based decision, financial-based decision in your green book, HM and Treasury style stuff. It is outside the realms of planning, but it probably sits with our economic development colleagues that do things, our regen sort of consultants and teams. We should be thinking about it there because actually sometimes when things have happened, that decision's already been made. So that's what I mean, that it sometimes sits earlier. And I actually think that therefore, like, that's on the government side. So I'm hoping that we can get developers to think about it earlier
love
too.
That. Great
But
idea. Yeah.
I just also need to say, obviously we're planners and this is what we're talking about, but let's not lose the sight that it's not the planning that created gender inequality. This is just one element of addressing it, because we need to address throughout the whole system. But obviously it's not just planning. I wish it was. It would be very much easier to change. It is.
Yeah.
When we're talking about housing, it's not only planning. Our housing policies, it's the economy, our, the loans,
it's
and
the
it's the
money.
banks, it's money.
Yes.
Everything comes down to, is this beneficial to those who actually hold the power, who hold money? And to me, that will be part of ESG. So can you get borrowings cheaper if you're gender equitable?
Less risk averse, I would say. So you're a less risky person to lend to if
Exactly.
you're compliant with your ESG. And the ESG, like, there's a lot of focus on environmental and not social and governance. And this sits in the social and
Exactly.
governance.
Did we define ESG for this?
Environment, social and governance. So it's like corporate social responsibility. It's a new version of it. Some people are pretty negative and sort of, I don't think it's really doing anything. But I do think if there are some hooks, like there are with social value, there are some hooks there. So the environment bit is the bit we all know about. It's the BREEAM, it's the climate change, etc., net zero, all of those bits. The G is more about the governance of your organisation. And so that's where what I would call descriptive representation sits, which is like actually how many women or marginalised groups is the term I prefer using. Marginalised groups sit on your board. Is it 50-50, etc.? So then you can show that you're less risk averse in that way. And then the social bit is probably the bit that fits in with planning. And it probably is like a social value bit. And I do think there's probably a hook around calculating social value and linking that back to some sort of gender or thinking about it in a sort of demographic way.
Folks who are interested in social value as a planning consideration can also go back and listen to our episode with Cleo folks at Thrive, where we talk a lot about this, and it's fascinating.
And I would just say this is also a common practice among large development banks. So EBRD has a whole team of gender experts who are actually looking how the development proposals, so infrastructure and development, actually impacts gender equality. So it's a common practice.
Yes, and I think actually when I went to one of the launch events for the Arab Designing Cities at Work for Women, somebody had come back from working from the World Bank and was just like, we do all this gender mainstreaming, we do all this gender budgeting. I can't believe the UK is so far behind.
I like this idea of gender budgeting. I think it makes a lot of sense. And I'm all for something that upstreams this from basically two planners having to sit opposite each other at the table.
I was going to say your desk.
Yeah, exactly. Where I'm being asked to prove that we've done enough. They're being asked to decide whether I've done enough. And no one knows because there isn't an answer. Or we both come to an answer, but each of us has our own sort of principled details about what that would mean in a built environment. So if we can put that all upstream, would it be a gender equitable decision by government to properly fund grant funding for affordable housing and to require RPs to acquire affordable units?
Yes.
Please say yes.
I think it would be because, what we've discussed. And if you look at, it's totally dependent on the place, right? Because I spoke to somebody that worked on the High Streets Task Force and they were doing some digital planning work or technologically enabled planning, whatever you want to call it. And I think they'd looked at the demographics there. And actually the affordable housing need, or what had happened to the HMOs, it was either Bolton or Blackburn. A lot of the town centre had been turned into HMOs through like sort of permitted development rights and so on. Yeah. And it was mainly men, single men living in them. So the affordable housing need seems like in that particular area is single men. Why we were discussing it is because it was making women feel unsafe in the town centre because it was overly populated by one particular demographic. So that was why it's been talked about. But it's interesting that the affordable housing, the need there will be different. But then I think from the statistics, if you look on the ONS, it's single mothers who are looking after kids that really desperately need affordable housing.
And who won't be in the HMOs because it's just a bedroom with a lock on it, right? So they won't be there, but they'll be in an overcrowded C3 unit somewhere else. Shout out to all my single men.
Does that not come full circle in the policy is high level and say you must provide affordable housing that meets a certain need, but then there's enough information available for you to understand exactly what that need is?
Yes, or even just any demographic data. Priya Shah always talks about why she set up BAME in property, which is now Preach Inclusion, in that she was working, I think, in Harrow, and she was working on older people's housing, and she's working on something where it was older people's housing, and it was a standard sort of model that one of the older people's housing providers produce. And the issue, it wasn't selling. And it wasn't selling because it hadn't thought about the demographic of that area, which was Sikh. And it wasn't designed for them. Like we keep talking about it needs to be, it wasn't designed for them. So it didn't sell. It didn't meet their needs. And so, yeah, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be for women. It could be for whatever demographic is needed in that area. And I feel like we're moving further and further away from that. And we're just getting very generic policy that is a one-size-fits-all.
Shout out Sarah Chapman, who is in season 1, episode 7, who talks a lot about needs and place-specific solutions for transport. She's at Marquides. Really good episode.
I mean, there's a win there for developers where it's not just about seeking the planning need. It's actually you're creating a residential development which would sell and is in demand and will actually make a valuable difference.
Yeah, designed for your actual customer and end user.
I think that's a good place to end. Marina Milosev and Charlotte Morphet, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
It's a great discussion.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Make Planning Make Sense. Please do give the show a follow, and please share the show to keep the conversation going and the community growing. Find us on Instagram, X, and Blue Sky at MPMS Podcast, or write to us at podcast@centroplan.co.uk. Make Planning Make Sense is presented by Centro Planning Consultancy and recorded in beautiful London, England. Its executive producer is me, Aaron Zimmerman. Marketing and promotion by our colleague, Reese Raymond. Graphic design by our colleague, Mariam Malaxi. Music by Joseph McDade. From all of us here at Centro, thanks again for listening.